Let me now move on to ask you about what has been known as the Chomsky Piaget debate back in 1975. This was very interesting because Piaget brought to the table an approach to children's development, particularly regarding language and other aspects of cognition, that was different from the behaviorists, but also regarded an interaction between the agent and its environment. And on the other hand, back then you defended a more innatist or nativist approach to those kinds of problems. So could you tell us briefly maybe what were some of the biggest issues that were debated back then?
Well, the biggest issues were exactly what you just said, is development of language capacity and other cognitive capacities a matter of following a fixed plan that's part of our genetic endowment, modified, of course, by the environment. So your genes don't determine whether you speak English or Spanish. But is there a kind of a basically fixed plan that directs the child reflexively? The child doesn't think about it any more than you think about growing arms, but it sort of sketches out the basic plan of development with experience, modifying it around the edges? Or is there some process of maturation or moving from stage to stage, which that doesn't involve any innate genetically determined components? And that was the core argument, the debate. Incidentally, neither Piaget or I regarded it as a debate. The debate idea was created by the publishers. It was supposed to be a conference where he and I opened it with our own presentations, and others came in and gave their presentations. But I guess the publishers felt that they could sell the book better if they turned it into a debate, but neither of us approved of that move. But it was a discussion among many cognitive scientists, some from Piaget's Institute, Barbara Inhelder and others, some from here. My friend Jerry Fodor was an active participant, and others. And there was a lot of interaction about the nature of these problems.
Mm-hmm. And wasn't it another issue that was brought to the table, the one that had to do with modularity of mind? And you and Fodor, if I'm not mistaken, defended a position where you believed that the mind was composed of several different modules, each of which had to deal with different cognitively distinct problems, correct?
That's correct.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that those different modules were the result of natural selection and are mostly genetically determined, or at least genetically based, or not?
First of all, we have to distinguish genetically determined from a product of natural selection.
Okay.
Remember, Piaget in particular was very skeptical about natural selection altogether. Mm-hmm. In fact, so much so that a number of the distinguished biologists present, Jacques Monod, François Jacob, the laureates in biology, were pretty much shocked by some of his positions. Actually, some of what he proposed then does not sound quite as exotic today as it did at the time, because of discoveries in what have been called, it's been called epigenetics, the way experience has some peripheral limited effects in complex ways on changing the nature of the genetic endowment. But his general anti-Darwinian position is not suggested. In my case, and also Fodor and Massimo Piatelli, who organized the meeting, who was a biologist. In fact, Fodor and Piatelli have just written a book recently called Why Darwin Was Wrong, in which they review many discoveries in recent years, which have shown that many natural processes take place that are critical for evolution over and above natural selection. They even raise some questions about the nature of natural selection, but I think we can concede that that's a critical element of evolution. Darwin was largely right about that, but there are many other ways in which the genetic, the genome, the arrangement of genes changes through genetic drift, transposition of genes from one place to another, even from one organism to another. Lots of processes take place that yield the genetic endowment of the particular organism. Its genotype. So yes, I think it's, my view, reasonably clear that there is a specific genetic endowment for language that humans have, no other organism has. That's why, as I mentioned before, we can't do the kinds of comparative studies about language that you can do with vision and other pretty much shared capacities. There's no known explanation for that other than genetic endowment. Of course, to find the basis in the genome for particular capacities is very difficult, even for simple traits like height, let's say, where nobody doubts it's genetically determined. To try to find the hundreds of genes involved in determining height is what biologists sometimes call fiendishly difficult problem. So it's not going to be simple to find the genetic endowment for language. That's a huge problem. But the fact that it's there, I think, is pretty well established. In fact, that's why an infant, a 2-year-old infant, has an amazing knowledge of language, as you can discover by experiment, even though it's had very little experience. Why, if you look at the language development of infants, it goes through a very fixed program of development. In fact, a newborn infant already has some information about the language of its mother, can identify the language of its mother as distinct from another language, both spoken by a woman whose voice they've never heard, a bilingual woman. And by now, lots understood about that. And then there's a regular series of progressions that the infant goes through. Of course, it's modified by experience, but it seems to be just similar to other genetic programs. There have been extensive efforts, to try to elicit something like language behavior from other organisms, usually apes. It's been a total failure. They simply don't have the cognitive capacities that allow them to use the data that an infant uses just reflexively. And that's also has to be the basis for the fact that languages generally seem to be cast to the same mold in some deep sense, even if they look on the surface to be very varied. I should say that this doctrine about the almost endless variation of languages was also held about organisms in the 1950s. So a standard view among biologists was that organisms are so varied that you just have to study each one basically on its own. That's now known to be completely wrong. Discoveries of recent years have shown that there are very few types of organisms. They have deep properties that they all share. It's even been suggested, taken seriously, that there's a universal genome, a single fixed genome, which slight modifications gives you different organisms. It's pictures somewhat like what seems to have been discovered about language over the years. A lot of this is contentious. I don't want to suggest that there's an overwhelming consensus about that, but that's the way the evidence looks to me increasingly. I don't see any, I really see no serious alternative to this view.